All right, let's dive in today into a topic that I think we all know is very important, and that's major depression. We've got kind of a mountain of research here, medical textbooks, research papers, even some personal stories. And I think our mission today is really to kind of sift through all of this and pull out the most valuable pieces for you. And one thing that really struck me early on was just how sneaky depression can be. It's not always that like stereotypical picture of sadness. Sometimes it kind of hides behind other things like physical problems or even just feeling tired all the time. And did you know there's actually a term for when grief gets so intense that it becomes clinical depression? It's called pathological bereavement.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of how multifaceted and complex depression really is. It can be like a chameleon, really hard to pin down. And I think that's why it's so important to really separate fact from fiction, especially because depression affects so many people. Whether you're dealing with it personally or maybe work in a related field or just want to be more informed, this deep dive is for you.
I think that's a great point and a good place to start. Like what exactly is major depression? How is it different from, just having a bad day or feeling down every now and then?
Right. So major depression, it's a clinical diagnosis, meaning it's not just, feeling blue for a day or two. We're talking about a cluster of symptoms that stick around for a while.
Mm.
And those symptoms can range from, feeling sad or losing interest in things you used to enjoy to changes in your sleep, your appetite, even your energy levels. The key here is that these symptoms, they actually start to interfere with your everyday life, making it difficult to, you know, just function normally.
That makes sense. I mean, I was
Yeah.
looking through the source material, and there's a whole list of potential symptoms, everything from mood swings to like headaches and stomach problems. It makes me wonder how often people misinterpret those signs, maybe blaming them on stress or something else entirely.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why diagnosing depression can be so tricky. It often disguises itself as something else. For example, some people experience what's called somatization. This is where their depression shows up mainly through physical symptoms. So you can imagine going to the doctor for chronic fatigue or digestive issues, only to find out that the root cause is actually depression.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful example. I mean,
Yeah.
it really underscores how we can't just rely on appearances to understand someone's mental health. I guess it's a reminder to be more tuned in to those subtle signs,
Yeah.
both in ourselves and the people around us.
Exactly. And speaking of being tuned in, one of the most helpful ways to understand depression is through the stress vulnerability model. This model basically says that depression isn't caused by just one thing. It's more about a combination of our biological predispositions, things like genetics and brain chemistry. And then the stressful events that we experience in life.
Right, so like that pathological bereavement we talked about earlier. The research suggests that some people might be genetically more vulnerable to developing depression after a big loss. So it's not about being weak if you struggle after someone close to you passes away. It could be that your genes make you more sensitive to that kind of stress.
That's a really important takeaway, I think. It reminds us that depression isn't a character flaw, but a complex interaction between our biology and our environment.
And this makes me think about how depression can show up so differently across different age groups. The sources actually talk about the specific challenges of recognizing and treating depression in the elderly and in teenagers. What are some of the things we should keep in mind when we're talking about these populations?
Yeah, you're right. Age plays a huge role in how depression presents itself. With older adults, it's often less about outward sadness and more about physical complaints, maybe changes in their sleep or appetite, or even cognitive issues like memory problems. Imagine an older person complaining about constant fatigue and difficulty concentrating. It might be easy to just brush that off as part of aging, when in reality, it could be a sign of depression.
Right. And like we were talking about before, those symptoms could also be mistaken for side effects from medication, which are pretty common in older adults. It sounds like it can be a real puzzle to figure out what's going on.
It definitely can be, and it really highlights how important it is to have thorough assessments that take everything into account. Not just mood, but, the whole picture.
Yeah.
Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have teenagers, and they come with their own unique challenges.
Yeah, I mean, teenagers can be tough to read even at the best of times, let alone when they might be dealing with depression.
Exactly, and their depression might not always look like classic sadness either. It might show up as irritability, anger, withdrawing from friends and family, or even engaging in risky behavior. Imagine a teenager who is a straight-A student and suddenly their grades plummet and they start lashing out at their parents. While it could just be typical teenage angst, it could also be a sign of something more serious going on.
It sounds like with both the elderly and teenagers, we need to be really paying attention to those less obvious signs and be willing to look beyond the surface, considering the whole person, their life circumstances, and any other health issues they might have.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial part of managing depression no matter what age, and that's suicide risk assessment and management.
This is where things get really serious.
Yeah.
And the source material goes into quite a bit of detail about the different levels of suicide risk and how to manage them. It's a sobering reminder that depression can be life-threatening and that stepping in proactively is absolutely critical.
It's a difficult topic for sure, but we can't shy away from it. The sources really emphasize how important it is to recognize the warning signs. Things like talking about death or suicide, giving away possessions, or sudden extreme mood swings. These are red flags that should never be ignored.
It's a heavy reminder that we need to be vigilant, both for ourselves and the people we care about. But even with all of the seriousness, there is hope. The sources also talk about all the different treatments and ways to manage depression. And there's some really effective options available.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a hopeless situation at all. And one of the most important points the sources make is that treatment needs to be individualized. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for another.
So it's about finding the right combination of therapies, ones that address the specific needs and circumstances of each person. The sources actually outline a whole range of approaches, from basic counseling and lifestyle changes to more specialized therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT.
Right, and it's not just about the mind either. The body plays a big role too. Lifestyle changes like regular exercise, eating a balanced diet, and getting enough sleep, those can have a huge impact on your mood and your overall well-being.
So it's about taking a holistic approach, really, recognizing that our physical and mental health are completely interconnected. But I imagine for some people, therapy and lifestyle changes might not be enough. That's where medication comes in, right?
Yeah, and the sources talk specifically about antidepressants, especially a type called SSRIs. They're often the first choice for treatment because they're generally safe and effective.
But it's not as simple as just taking a pill and poof, everything's better, right? The sources are pretty clear that it's important to be careful, to monitor things closely, and to find the right medication and dosage for each person.
You're absolutely right. Medication should always be part of a bigger treatment plan, one that includes therapy and lifestyle changes. And deciding to use medication should always be done with the guidance of a healthcare professional.
It's about teamwork, really. Finding the right approach that addresses all aspects of someone's well-being. And thinking about this multifaceted approach, it makes me consider the impact depression has not just on individuals, but on families, workplaces, society as a whole.
Yeah, it really creates a ripple effect. Depression doesn't exist in isolation. It affects everyone around the person who's struggling. Families carry the emotional and often the financial burden of supporting a loved one with depression. Workplaces see less productivity and more people missing work. And the healthcare system is strained by the costs of treatment and care.
I was actually reading about the huge economic costs associated with depression and the sources. It's a public health issue with some pretty far-reaching consequences.
It really is. And it reminds us that addressing depression isn't just about individual well-being. It's about creating a healthier, more productive, and more compassionate society.
And I think that starts with breaking down the stigma surrounding mental health, promoting understanding, and encouraging people to seek help. Because, as we've been discussing, depression can be so hidden, masked by other issues. And so many people suffer in silence.
You're exactly right. We need to create a culture where talking about mental health is just as normal as talking about physical health, where asking for help is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
It's about building a safety net where people feel comfortable reaching out for support when they need it. And that support might come from family, friends, healthcare professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does take a village, as they say. And the more we normalize talking about mental health, the easier it will be for people to recognize the signs in themselves and others, and to get the help they deserve.
It's a collective effort, for sure. Speaking of recognizing signs, something that really stood out to me from the sources was this concept of masking. We've touched on it a bit already, but I think it's worth emphasizing as we wrap up this part of our dive. Depression is really good at disguising itself, and it can show up in ways we might not immediately connect with a mental health condition.
It's such a critical point to keep in mind. Someone struggling with depression might not always look sad or withdrawn. They might be irritable, agitated, complain about physical problems, or even seem perfectly fine on the surface.
Yeah, it's like an iceberg, where what we see is just the tip. And that's why it's so crucial to be aware of those subtle signs. to really listen to people and to be compassionate in how we interact with them.
I couldn't agree more. Compassion and empathy are so important. Sometimes just listening without judgment can be the most powerful form of support we can offer.
And sometimes that support might mean encouraging someone to seek professional help.
You're right. Knowing when to suggest professional help is important. It's recognizing that we can't always be the solution for someone else's struggles, and that there are times when professional intervention is necessary.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Knowing when to lend an ear and when to suggest seeking professional help. But I think it goes back to what we were saying about education and awareness. The more we understand about depression, the better equipped we are to handle those tough situations.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to mental health. And if there's one thing to take away from all of this research, it's that depression is treatable. There is hope and recovery is possible.
That is such an important message. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and hopeless when you're facing a depression diagnosis, whether it's your own or a loved one's. But knowing that effective treatments exist is incredibly empowering.
It really is. And those treatments, as we've talked about, can include therapy, lifestyle changes, medication, support groups. The key is finding the right combination for each person.
You know, as we're talking about all these treatment options, it makes me wonder about the future of depression care. Like, what's on the horizon? What are researchers exploring in terms of new therapies and approaches?
It's a great question, and it's something that researchers all over the world are working on. The field of mental health is constantly evolving, and there's some really exciting research underway. For example, there's growing interest in personalized medicine, tailoring treatments to an individual's unique genetic makeup and brain chemistry.
That sounds like something out of science fiction, but in a good way. Imagine being able to pinpoint the exact type of therapy or medication that would be most effective for each person, based on their specific biology.
It's a really promising area of research, one that could completely revolutionize how we approach depression treatment. There's also ongoing research into non-invasive brain stimulation techniques, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which is showing potential in treating depression, especially for people who haven't responded well to traditional therapies.
It's incredible to think about the possibilities. But even with all these advances, I think it's crucial to remember that technology isn't the whole answer. We can't forget the importance of human connection, empathy, and the relationship between a patient and their healthcare provider.
I completely agree. Technology can be a powerful tool, but it should complement, not replace, the human element of care.
Well said. As we start to wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier. The impact depression has on society. It's not just an individual struggle. It affects families, communities, entire healthcare systems.
You're right. And one of the biggest challenges is dealing with the stigma around mental health. We need to keep challenging those misconceptions and create a culture of openness and understanding.
It's about shifting the narrative from shame and silence to support and empowerment. Because ultimately, breaking down stigma is essential to encourage people to seek help and to make sure they get the care they need.
Absolutely. We need to create a world where talking about mental health is as normal as talking about physical health, a world where seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Well said. So as we conclude this exploration of major depression, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think it's this. Depression is complex, but it's treatable. There is hope and recovery is possible. If you're struggling, please reach out for help. You don't have to go through this alone.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about depression, the better we can support ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities. We've only scratched the surface today, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and maybe sparked a curiosity to learn more.
It's been great exploring this with you.
Likewise, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into major depression. Be sure to check out the show notes for additional resources and information. Until next time, take care.
Yeah, it's a tough subject, but one we need to talk about for sure. The sources really emphasize the importance of being able to recognize those warning signs. Things like if someone starts talking about death or suicide, or giving away their possessions, or if you notice those really sudden and intense mood swings, those are serious red flags and they should never be ignored.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark reminder that we need to be paying attention.
Yeah.
Both to our own mental health and to the people around us. But even with all the heaviness of this topic, there is hope. The sources also go into detail about the different treatments and ways to manage depression. And there's some really effective options out there.
Absolutely. It's definitely not a hopeless situation. And one of the most important things the sources emphasize is that treatment really needs to be tailored to the individual. There's no magic bullet that works for everyone you know. What helps one person might not help another.
So it's about finding that right mix of therapies, the ones that really address the specific needs and circumstances of each person. And the sources actually outline a whole bunch of different approaches, from basic counseling and lifestyle changes to more specialized therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT.
Right. And it's not just about focusing on the mind either. Our bodies play a huge role too, making changes to your lifestyle like getting regular exercise, eating a balanced diet, and making sure you're getting enough sleep. Those can have a massive impact on your mood and at how you feel overall.
It's about taking a holistic approach, I guess, recognizing that our physical and mental health are totally intertwined. But for some people, therapy and lifestyle changes alone might not be enough. And that's when medication could be an option.
Exactly. And the sources specifically talk about antidepressants, particularly a class of drugs called SSRIs. They're often the first line of treatment because they generally have a pretty good safety profile and they can be very effective.
But it's not just as simple as popping a pill and everything magically gets better, is it? The sources really stress the importance of careful consideration and monitoring, and making sure you find the right medication and the right dose for each individual.
You're absolutely right. Medication should always be part of a comprehensive plan. That includes therapy and those lifestyle modifications we talked about. And any decision to start medication should always be made in consultation with a healthcare professional.
It's about teamwork, really. Finding that right approach that considers all aspects of a person's well-being. And this idea of a multifaceted approach makes me think about the impact depression has, not just on the individual, but on families, workplaces, society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a ripple effect. Depression doesn't just exist in a bubble. It affects everyone around the person who's struggling. Families often carry the emotional and financial burden of supporting a loved one with depression. Workplaces see decreased productivity and increased absenteeism. And the healthcare system is burdened with the cost of treatment and care.
The sources actually highlight those economic costs in quite a bit of detail. It's clearly a public health issue with some pretty far-reaching consequences.
It really is, and it's a sobering reminder that addressing depression isn't just about individual well-being. It's about investing in a healthier, more productive, and more compassionate society as a whole.
And I think a big part of that is breaking down the stigma that still surrounds mental health, promoting understanding and encouraging people to reach out for help. Because as we've been saying, depression can be so hidden, masked by other problems. And so many people suffer in silence.
You hit the nail on the head there. We need to create a culture where talking about your mental health is just as normal as talking about your physical health, where asking for help is seen as a sign of strength, not a weakness.
It's about building that safety net, where people feel comfortable reaching out when they need it. And that support could come from family, friends, healthcare providers.
Absolutely. It really does take a village. And the more we normalize these conversations about mental health, the easier it'll be for people to recognize the signs in themselves and in others, and to get the help they need and deserve.
It's a collective effort for sure. Something that really stuck with me from the sources was this idea of masking. We touched on it before, but I think it's worth repeating as we wrap up this part of our deep dive. Depression is a master of disguise.
Yeah.
It can show up in ways we might not immediately think of as being related to mental health.
It's a really important point. Someone struggling with depression might not always seem sad or withdrawn. They might be irritable, easily agitated, complain about physical symptoms, or even appear to be functioning just fine on the surface.
Yeah, it really is like an iceberg, isn't it? What we see is just a small part of what's actually going on.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of those more subtle signs, to really listen to people and to be compassionate in our interactions with them.
I think that's so important. Compassion and empathy are crucial. Sometimes just listening without judgment can be the most powerful thing we can do for someone.
You're absolutely right. And sometimes that support might also involve encouraging someone to reach out for professional help.
Right. Knowing when to suggest that can be tricky.
Yeah.
But it's important.
It is. It's about recognizing that, we can't always be the solution for someone else's struggles. And there are times when professional help is really necessary.
It's finding that balance, isn't it, between offering support and knowing when to encourage professional help. But I think that comes back to education and awareness. The more we understand about depression, the better we'll be able to navigate those situations.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to mental health. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from all this research is that depression is treatable. There's hope and recovery is possible.
That's such a powerful message
Yeah.
because it's easy to feel overwhelmed and hopeless when you're dealing with a depression diagnosis, whether it's your own or someone you love. But knowing that there are effective treatments out there, that's incredibly empowering.
It really is. And those treatments, as we've talked about, can range from therapy to lifestyle changes to medication to support groups. The key is finding what works best for each individual.
As we're talking about all these different treatments, it makes me wonder about the future of depression care. What's coming down the pipeline? What are researchers looking into in terms of new therapies and approaches?
That's a great question, and something that researchers all over the world are actively exploring. The field of mental health is constantly evolving, and there's a lot of really exciting research going on. For example, there's growing interest in personalized medicine tailoring treatments to an individual's unique genetic makeup and brain chemistry.
That sounds almost futuristic in a good way.
Yeah.
Imagine being able to pinpoint the exact therapy or medication that would work best for someone, based on their own biology.
It's definitely a promising area of research, one that has the potential to revolutionize how we approach depression treatment. There's also a lot of research happening with non-invasive brain stimulation techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation or TMS. It's showing promise in treating depression, particularly for people who haven't had success with more traditional therapies.
It's amazing to think about the possibilities, but even with all these advancements in technology, we have to remember that technology isn't everything. We can't lose sight of the importance of human connection, empathy, the relationship between a patient and their healthcare provider.
I completely agree. Technology can be an incredible tool, but it should enhance the human side of care, not replace it.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to touch back on something we discussed earlier. The impact depression has on society as a whole. It's not just an individual struggle. It affects families, communities, even entire healthcare systems.
You're right, and one of the biggest challenges we face is tackling the stigma that still surrounds mental health. We have to keep challenging those misconceptions and fostering a culture of openness and understanding.
It's about shifting the narrative from shame and silence to one of support and empowerment. Because at the end of the day, breaking down stigma is crucial to encourage people to seek help and to make sure they get the care they deserve.
Exactly. We need to create a world where talking about mental health is as common and as accepted as talking about physical health. A world where asking for help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
So well said. As we conclude this deep dive into major depression, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I'd say this depression is a complex condition, but it's treatable, there is hope, and recovery is possible. If you're struggling, please reach out for help. You don't have to go through this alone.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about depression, the better we can support ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities. We've only scratched the surface today, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and sparked your curiosity to learn more.
It's been great exploring this topic with you.
It has. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into major depression. Be sure to check the show notes for more information and resources. Until next time, take care.